Have you ever felt frustrated with yourself because you keep seeing the same weaknesses, the same fears, the same mistakes, the same struggles you thought you would have overcome by now? And maybe you love God deeply. Maybe you genuinely want to grow. But sometimes you look at your life and quietly wonder, why am I still like this? Because there's a difference between knowing who you want to become and actually feeling like you're becoming that person. And in between those two places, there can be a lot of discouragement. Maybe you've had moments where you felt strong in your faith, only to later struggle with fear again. Moments where you felt confident, only to shrink back under pressure. Moments where you promised yourself, "This time I'll do better," but somehow found yourself falling into old patterns again. And if we're honest, that can make you question whether real transformation is even possible. Not just behavior modification, not temporary motivation, but deep, lasting transformation. There's someone in Scripture who understands that struggle more than most: Peter. When we first meet Peter in John chapter 1, he is not the bold preacher we often think about. He is simply Simon, ordinary, impulsive, still becoming. And yet something remarkable happens when Jesus meets him. Jesus looks at Simon and says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. Cephas, Peter, rock. Think about that for a moment. Jesus gives him a new identity before Peter's life reflects it. That's important because Peter does not immediately look like a rock, not even close. He is emotional, reactive, sometimes bold, sometimes fearful. One moment he walks on water, another moment he sinks in doubt. One moment he declares loyalty to Jesus, another moment he denies even knowing him. And honestly, that inconsistency feels painfully human, because many of us know what it feels like to love God while still struggling with weakness. But Jesus saw something deeper in Peter. Not just who he was in that moment, but who he could become through transformation. And maybe someone listening today needs to hear this. God is not only looking at your current condition, He is looking at your potential through His grace. That changes the way we see ourselves, because many people define themselves by their worst moments, their failures, their insecurities, their past. But Jesus often speaks identity before transformation is visible. And that can feel uncomfortable, because sometimes God calls you into something before you feel ready for it, before your confidence catches up, before your character is fully refined. Peter experienced this repeatedly. In Matthew 16, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Matthew 16:15. And Peter responds, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Matthew 16:16. It's a powerful moment. Peter sees something spiritually that others are missing, and Jesus responds, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Matthew 16:18. Imagine hearing those words, Jesus speaking purpose over your life, calling you foundational, calling you part of something eternal. Yet what's remarkable is this: Peter still had so much growing to do, because only chapters later, we see Peter struggling again. Fear, confusion, impulsiveness, even after walking closely with Jesus. And maybe that's encouraging in an unexpected way, because transformation with God is often a process, not a single moment. We live in a world that loves instant results, instant success, instant confidence, instant growth. But spiritual transformation is usually slower than we expect, deeper than we expect, and often more uncomfortable than we expect, because God is not just changing behavior, He is renewing identity, and identity transformation takes time. There's a painful moment in Peter's story that many people know well. The night Jesus is arrested, Peter insists he will never abandon him, never deny him. Yet when pressure comes, fear takes over, and Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Can you imagine the shame of that moment? The regret? The disappointment? The self-condemnation? Because failure feels especially painful when you believed you were stronger than that. And maybe you've experienced moments like that too. Moments where your fear became louder than your faith. Moments where you disappointed yourself. Moments where you thought, I should be further along by now. But Peter's story does not end in failure, and neither does yours. After the resurrection, Jesus restores Peter, not with humiliation, not with rejection, but with love and invitation. 3 times Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" John 21:15-17. And with every question, Jesus is not just restoring Peter's confidence, he is restoring Peter's calling. That matters deeply. Because God does not abandon people because they struggled. He restores those who return to him. And slowly, Peter begins to change. Not instantly, but genuinely. Then we arrive at Acts 10 and 11. And this is where Peter's transformation becomes especially powerful. Because now, God challenges not only Peter's fear, but Peter's understanding, his assumptions, his limitations, his view of who God's grace is for. Peter receives a vision from God, a vision that disrupts the boundaries he had grown comfortable with. And through this experience, God begins teaching Peter that the gospel is bigger than his expectations, bigger than tradition, bigger than prejudice. Acts 10 becomes a turning point. Because Peter not only experiences personal transformation, he begins participating in God's larger mission. And this is important. True transformation does not stop with personal healing. It changes how you love people, how you see people, how you respond to God's calling. Peter, the man who once struggled with fear, now boldly preaches truth. Peter, the man who once denied Jesus publicly, now publicly proclaims him. Peter, the man who once struggled with instability, becomes someone God uses to strengthen others. Not because Peter became perfect, but because surrender allowed God to transform him over time. And maybe that gives hope to someone listening today, because perhaps you feel stuck between who you are and who God is calling you to become. Maybe you see inconsistency in yourself. Maybe you feel frustrated with your growth. Maybe you feel discouraged by how long transformation is taking. But do not mistake slow growth for no growth. God is still working, even in the process, even in the setbacks, even in the uncomfortable stretching seasons. Philippians 1:6 says, "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion." Notice something beautiful there. God finishes what he starts. Peter's transformation did not happen because Peter tried harder. It happened because Peter stayed close to Jesus. And that matters. Because transformation is not ultimately produced through striving. It is produced through relationship, through surrender, through walking with God daily. So maybe today, instead of condemning yourself for where you are not yet, you need to recognize where God is already changing you. Maybe you are more patient than before, more aware than before, more dependent on God than before. That is growth. And perhaps the person you are becoming is already visible to God, even before you fully see it yourself. So do not give up in the middle of the process. Do not let discouragement convince you that change is impossible. Because the same God who transformed Peter is still transforming people today. And maybe one day, you will look back and realize the seasons that felt slow were the very seasons God was building strength, wisdom, and faith within you. If this message spoke to you today, take a moment to reflect. Where have you seen God slowly changing you, even in small ways? And if you want more faith-based encouragement and biblical motivational stories, Subscribe to Inspire and Believe TV, because transformation is possible, not through perfection, but through walking with God. And remember, Jesus called Peter rock long before Peter looked stable. And maybe God sees more in you right now than you can currently see in yourself.